maybe if you take the left side, it'll make it bigger. Delete the left side,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. My participants are over there. Oh gosh.
Better? There you go. Much better. Thank you.
Sure.
Perfection.
Thank you.
It's streamed and it's on our website. We have both of your meetings there in green tiles.
Excellent. Thank you, Miguel.
All right, let me give full control to who again?
Deborah.
And of course, remember, you have the ability to stop the YouTube now.
Great.
So that's
Thank
probably
you.
what happened the first time.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Let me know if you got it. It didn't work. It worked. Took two times the first time. Did you get it?
Yes, I am the host now.
Welcome, everyone. This is Margie Tatro, working with GridWorks and supporting the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. It's 1 p.m. and it looks like we've got 11 participants. So I'm going to give just another minute or two. And thank you for joining us, for being part of our advancing the advanced inverter adoption process. So we'll just give it another minute or two and then we'll get started. I'll post the agenda on the screen share in case anybody wants to see where we're headed in this sprint toward a report. All right, I think we'll get going. It looks like we have great representation from many of the key participants in our process today. And on behalf of myself and Arthur O'Donnell, who I'll turn over in a moment to make some announcements, we'd like to thank you for helping us advance this conversation about the adoption of IEEE 1547 2018, the advanced inverters, as part of the interconnection update process here in New Mexico. Our agenda today, you can see on the screen after a few announcements. We are really going to dive into the conversation about communications protocols, the interoperability conversation about how to make sure that the DER systems being installed can connect to the communication systems that are being used by the electric power system providers. So that's our main conversation today. And then we'll do a summary of actions and schedule of our next meetings. We'll have a couple more meetings to talk about communication protocols. And then in August, we will be reviewing the group's recommendations, which is the final report that we have due to the PRC by September 16th. And so I'm sure we will visit some technical issues that we didn't complete our conversations on while we're doing the review, but I decided it's better that we launch into this communications conversation here in the month of July. So with that, let me turn this over to Arthur. I know that he might want to update the group on a couple other proceedings, and then I'll talk about the outline of our group's report, which is available. So Arthur, over to you.
Margie, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us again. It continues to gratify me that so many of you are taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in the Commission stakeholder engagement proceedings. We really value your participation and your input. May not always reflect in what comes out of the Commission, but we don't all have control over that. There hasn't been a lot of new development in the couple of proceedings that we've been following. I will point out that the transcript for the interconnection public hearing that was held on June 17th is now posted in the docket for the interconnection proceeding. That's 21-00266-UT, in case you want to review that. We were uncertain as to whether the Commission was going to extend the closing date of that proceeding, which was scheduled in the scoping memo as June 27th, so earlier this week. I have not seen anything along those lines, so I'm going to presume that the record of the phase 1 interconnection is now closed, and it would take an action by the Commission to revisit that. So we have all of the comments and all of the responses and the hearing transcript now to go through and kind of, revise what the final rule is going to go before the Commission. And then what the Commission does is certainly up to the Commission. But it's been a long haul, and we appreciate it. I had hoped that we would be finished with that by the time we got to this point in phase 2, but that's the way it goes. I'll also point out that we're kind of hitting a transition point in the Community Solar Act implementation program, in that we've spent the first 6 months of this year kind of finalizing the rules, which were put into effect as of April 1st, but they haven't actually taken effect yet because the rule hasn't been published yet. But that hasn't stopped the Commission from proceeding with developing the materials for the request for proposals for community solar projects. And we have a draft of all those rules, which were previewed in a June 13th workshop. We have a report from the organizations that were helping us with community outreach, and that's currently been provided to the Commission for review. So we're kind of like moving definitely into implementation, despite the fact that at least one utility has filed a challenge of the Community Solar Act rule at the state Supreme Court. The last thing that I saw was just a notice that it was being appealed, but I didn't see any of the substance of that. So I really have no idea as to what basis that they're arguing. Got an idea, but you got to wait to see the actual filing. So what's going to happen next in community solar is that we are in communication, in negotiations for a contract with a program administrator that will pick up the threads of implementation from the two groups that we've had working on it. And we're going to meet with that administrator and figure out when we can proceed with issuing the RFP. It was always thought all along that it would be in this quarter, right? In July to September timeframe. I anticipate that will still be the case. We haven't heard anything that would prevent us unless the state Supreme Court throws the whole thing out, and then there's no point in moving on, but I don't think that's going to happen. So anyway, there's nothing really to report. It's just that we're kind of like moving into another phase of that proceeding. All of this is, of course, within the context of the fact that the current commission is essentially going to be completely revamped as of January 1st of next year, as it changes from an elected commission to an appointed commission. I have absolutely no insight as to either the legislative effort to create a committee to start vetting candidates or what the governor has in mind. We do know that the change in the state constitution had several amendments that affect the jurisdiction of the agency. And kind of like, so, one of the other things that I'm doing is continuing the conversation within the agency about what's going to change, right? Where are the new lines of jurisdiction being drawn? And does it really mean anything for staff and the utilities and for all the interveners? And so that's going to be an ongoing conversation that we'll have between now and the end of the year. There's a lot of other things going on, but I think that that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about today for the interests of this. I will note that we had the 9th in a series of webinars for grid modernization today. I made a presentation about AMI in the context of grid modernization. If you're interested in that, you can find all the materials from the GridWorks website, and maybe Margie can put the link, or Deborah can put the link in the chat if you want that. And what's going to happen next in that is that on July 21st, there's going to be a final meeting with GridWorks in which they're going to be presenting their outline of report and recommendations to the commission on how to structure a notice of proposed rulemaking for grid modernization. It's not about AMI. AMI is just one little component, one little corner of that bigger picture, but it will, kind of take together a lot of the information that's been presented in the webinar series and recommendations for how the commission ought to look at structuring rules around the promotion of grid modernization technologies, infrastructure, and software systems that are going to be necessary, which really leads into what we're talking about now, because obviously we're not just putting in a requirement for inverters to be capable of certain technologies. There has to be a system for the utilities to communicate with those inverters, for customers to be able to be transmitting information that's useful to the utilities, and the utilities be able to use, analyze, and act upon that information going forward. And that's why we're talking about communications protocols today. It's forward thinking. We're not going to resolve these issues, I think, in the next 6 months, but we should be able to establish a platform for understanding of what needs to be done. So that's my hope. And I'll turn it back to Margie to begin that conversation. And thank you all again for being here. And Kevin Cray has raised his hand to ask a question that I probably won't be able to answer.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks, Arthur. Really, in relation to this kind of phase 2 effort, just curious how this fits in with the rulemaking. And I really apologize if this has been captured already, but will there basically be a subsequent rulemaking to incorporate the findings from this effort and this report into the interconnection rules, or will it be more of just like a policy decision issued by the commission, or just curious how this interrelates with the current rulemaking that's taking place?
Well, Kevin, as you know, we do have a placeholder in the proposed rule that fleshes out a little bit more than just advanced inverters will be required as of March 28th, 2023, in terms of identifying the capabilities and functions that we anticipate. I expect that we'll take one step further and use the recommendations from this subgroup in terms of establishing what's enabled and what's disabled at this point. My recommendation to the commission will be that anything further than that, any specifics about the settings or about thresholds or about utility specific functions or settings should go into technical guideline documents that are associated with interconnection but are not part and parcel of the rule. We've had a lot of conversation about that. We talked about that in the public hearing. And I think that the commission knows that not everything should go into the rule because things change, right? Especially when you're getting down to the level of settings, right? And thresholds of settings and kind of special circumstances, that really belongs in technical guideline documents. We know the utilities have those guidelines. We don't have a formal process for updating those. The commission in its rule order will probably provide some guidance for how to deal with that in the future, but no, I'm not anticipating revising the interconnection rule based on what we're doing today.
Excellent. Very helpful. Thank you, Arthur.
Great. Thanks, Arthur. Thanks for the question, Kevin. In fact, you'll see if you go to the draft, the outline of our working group report, I've put a place in that for possible listing of information that might go into technical guideline documents or technical interconnection interoperability requirements, TIIRs, whatever they end up being called. So we're trying to collect information that may be at a more detailed level that could be in those TIIRs or technical documents, but that's the way we're trying to capture information that might be used at a later point as a recommendation for that document. So you all can see that draft in the OneDrive folder. I'm not going to go into it right now, but you can see what it contains, and I'm welcoming any comments that you have on that as we work toward August to get a draft of our report. Also, the next topic, we have the proposal from the subgroup, and I want to thank Travis Dorr and Midhat Mafazi, Brian Leidick, Michael Ropp for helping really evolve the conversation on the specific functions and settings. What you'll see in the version that's in the OneDrive, and I'll make sure that it's the specific link is in the summary from today, but the version 5 of that subgroup's proposal now includes a section on the reference point of applicability. And the group has been working on that the past couple of weeks. There's some language now in that proposal toward the end that addresses that and some processes for determining such points. And so you'll see that in the subgroup's proposal. One of the topics that hasn't been vetted explicitly yet in that document is the discussion about normal ramp rates, especially for systems with storage. So that's a conversation and content that still needs to be developed. And maybe we come back to that in August if there's not sort of a consensus between now and then. But I'm really thankful for the group being working offline to put together language. And if any of you have comments, questions, input that you wanted to provide into that subgroup's proposal, please have a look at that version 5 and contact me or any of the 4 individuals I just mentioned who have been helping to develop that content. So let me pause there and ask if there are any questions on where we are before we jump into some more detail about the communications protocols. Any questions at this point? Okay, seeing none, let me now just show you some information that, hold on just a moment. Let me, technical difficulty here. Let me just get the right document open. Let me share my screen. I put together some information about the interoperability requirements. And if I can figure out how to go to full screen. Hopefully you can see this slide. Can somebody acknowledge it? You see something that says New Mexico Advanced Inverter Working Group? Okay,
Yep.
all right.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. It's just a few slides that really describe, I extracted information from the IEEE 1547-2018, and I borrowed extensively also from some great information put together by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to kind of get us started in this conversation. So as many of you know, after looking at the standard, the new IEEE 1547-2018 does require distributed energy resources to have provisions for a local communications interface. Now, it also says in the absence of a communications infrastructure, access to the settings of the DER must be available either through hardware or a software panel on site. So I think there are some key questions. We'll come back to these in our discussion today, but I wanted to queue them up so that you can see what some topics for conversation might be. For example, which DERs, perhaps those that meet a certain KVA threshold, which protocols, you'll see the options that are presented by the standard in a moment, which physical communication port or ports might be most acceptable and most convenient, and is the list of minimum information parameters, which I'll also describe, is that sufficient? Is it sufficient? Is it overkill? We'll have that conversation. And I think there are some principles for us to consider when we're having this discussion. For example, is it important or not to have consistency across utilities? What is going to be the cost of implementation? Will access by third-party aggregators be supported by whatever protocols are chosen? And then an interesting discussion is about what conditions the DERs can be remotely curtailed, turned off, or when changes to certain functions or settings may be warranted. That was a conversation that has come up in our previous meetings and is something we might want to talk about. Also considering the evolution of hardware, software, and standards. As many of you know, there's still standard work going on the whole area of interoperability and cybersecurity. And I have one slide on that. And then finally, security at the highest level. So those are some questions and some topics for us to consider while we're having this discussion. This next slide is one I borrowed from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it kind of gives a summary of this interoperability framework in the standard. You'll see in red up at the top here that we're really talking about the local DER interface that connects to the communications networks, to the DER resources. I already mentioned what the standard said, that this capability must be included with the for a DER interface. There are 3 communications protocols that are called out in the standard, and we'll talk about more in the next slide. I've got some more details on that. And the information that's supposed to be able to be exchanged with this protocol is the nameplate, and those are characteristics that describe the system. There are 21 parameters specified in that nameplate portfolio. There's monitoring metrics, and there are 8 parameters as monitoring parameters that are supposed to be able to be communicated. And those two, both the nameplate and the monitoring parameters, are to be read as opposed to read or written by the interface. So you could be able to see those characteristics, those parameters from the communications network, but they're not writable after installation and commissioning of the system. Then there are two other sets of parameters. There's the configuration parameters, which kind of is a compilation of the nameplate and monitoring and specific nameplate parameters that are in there as a set. And there are management specific parameters as well that can be read or written. And that would be the place where we need to talk about when updates or changes can be made. The communication performance is also defined in the standard, and it asks that the DER, that communication interface be available when the DER is operating in a continuous or mandatory condition, and that read response times would be less than 30 seconds. That's the maximum amount of time that a parameter request is supposed to be available to be read. The cybersecurity issues, as I mentioned, is an ongoing conversation. It's not currently in the scope of the published IEEE standard, but there is work being done on annex to the standard at this point. This is just another table that pulls out the details of the 3 protocols that are listed as eligible protocols in the standard. The transport, the format for the information, TCP/IP, and then the physical port, either Ethernet or an RS-485 port connection would be the physical connection if the SunSpec Modbus protocol is selected. So those are the 3 eligible protocols. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, the performance requirements in terms of when those need to be available and what is the response time are shown in this slide. This is just another way to depict that information that is to be available in non-proprietary encodings to be exchanged between the resource and the electric power system operator. So this is just a summary of the parameters I previously described. The detailed list of each of these parameters is included in section 10 of the standard itself. I didn't repeat them here, but clearly those categories of parameters are the ones that we've been talking about in the subgroups proposal on functions and settings. I mentioned this standards area is currently evolving. There's the evolving information on a interoperability and cybersecurity annex to IEEE 1547. It is more than a revision, I understand. It's quite a redo of that standard that was previously issued in 2007. So it's a bit old, and it's currently in the balloting phase of the standards process. I also understand that there's another annex 1547.10 being developed, and it is to more explicitly describe what are the requirements for a gateway piece of hardware plus software in between the EPS and the DER. And I don't know much about that. And I know there's people on this call who know a lot more about that. So we'll provide opportunities if people have questions or folks have more content that we'll get to that here in a moment. And so my last slide is really just to kick off our conversation. I'd really like to know what people think about this topic. What are your observations, comments, questions, any additions or changes to the set of principles that I described? And most importantly, our outcome for today is to form a subgroup who might be willing to work offline and develop a specific communications and interoperability protocol proposal before our next meeting in 2 weeks. So with that, let me stop. I know I've thrown a lot at all of you, but many of you have had a look at the standard, I'm sure. And I'd like to now just open it up to conversation on any of these topics. If you'd like to work on a a subgroup, or you'd like to have put input into this. Let me first start with you, Arthur, for your
Yeah,
comment.
Margie, can you go back to the slide that had the
Yes.
3 protocols, the
Yes.
SunSpec and the, so that I get it right.
Yep.
Okay, back.
Oh, too far.
Right here.
This one. Yep.
This one, yeah. Now, back when I last visited this issue in probably 2015, we had a lot of conversations about the proper protocols in California. And at that time, the conversation was really about DNP and SunSpec. And so that raises the question, is this IEEE 2030.5 relatively new? Can somebody give me some background about that as to kind of like how frequently it might be used in other places? Maybe our friends from IREC or Michael Rops on the line.
This is Brian with IREC. I can take a stab at it, but
Yeah.
it has been around for quite some time. I think it started out being developed as a smart meter related communications protocol, and I can't remember what it was called back then. But that protocol was adopted. It was kind of an industry protocol that became adopted by IEEE, and I don't recall the exact time frame as to when that happened, but it has been around in either the earlier form or 2030.5 for quite some time, and is actually the preferred communications protocol of the California IOUs moving forward. And we do expect to see good adoption. I'm not terribly familiar with how it's used today, and maybe the utilities actually have some feedback on how they are using it today or whatnot, but it's not generally deployed for the purposes of DER communications yet. Well, because there's no deployment of DER communications except through the traditional SCADA methods today.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That helps.
Yeah, Travis, you want to add?
Yeah. Thanks, Brian, for mentioning the utilities there, because I was just about to chime in. So example of 2030.5 devices includes, what we want to talk about, which is, inverters, energy storage, but even like a thermostat, a smartphone, a water heater, just kind of smart stuff in general. Smart appliances are examples of devices for IEEE 2030.5. So like Brian said, it's been around a while, and we're just getting excited to finally start using that standard for things like smart inverters.
So Travis, you're saying that those other devices, refrigerators, water heater, thermostats, all, that are being deployed as are currently using that 2030.5 protocol?
I believe so. I don't have intimate experience and knowledge with it. I just have familiarity with that standard, just based on previous work I've done with smart devices in the home. Like utilities will incentivize like a thermostat, right, that the utilities can't control. It just needs to be a smart device of some kind. Yeah, so it could be something like a water heater. It could even be a TV. It just needs to be smart and basically able to be interoperated, right? I like that word. And so I was going to go on to my next thing, unless I need to explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, let's
Okay.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Travis, and then I do want to
Okay.
also maybe hear from PNM or EPA on your thoughts about these 3 protocols that and specifically that Arthur mentioned.
Okay.
Go ahead, Travis.
Yeah, so yeah, and that is very important conversation. Okay, so let's see. I like the word interoperability, right? Can we go back to that slide where you had it defined there? And you'll see why. I just, someone please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know how much of an opinion versus a fact this is. Oh, the slide after this one, please. And this would be, I guess, an additional question for discussion, in addition to the list that you provided. Thank you very much for putting this all together, Margie. But you see that definition there, readily use. Okay, so I just want to kind of be on the same page with everyone when it comes to, we're talking about communication and control. We were talking about autonomous functions before. It seems like, that's we're able to move on, start talking about the next two, which is communication and control. I think that the way that we define interoperability would be both communication and control, not just communication. And I like that because using that word control is kind of a trigger word. People get emotional, keep your hands off of my, my stuff, right? And so I like the word interoperability. I've been having this discussion lately here at Excel, where let's, when we go to publish this information for the public, let's try to avoid, where possible, using the word control, and instead use the word interoperate, I don't know, interoperability, right? So I just wanted to, kind of open up that question for discussion. Is interoperability both communication and control?
Yeah. No, super good question. You can see how the standard is defined by how IEEE defines interoperability there, right? Capability to externally exchange and use information securely and effectively.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that does mean using the information, to optimize the performance, or you could expand on that, but what do others think? Does that interoperability capture both the information plus the use of that information to do control functions? That's a good question.
This is Brian. I think it does. I think if it's just a one-way flow of information, we would call it monitoring, right?
Okay.
So this is beyond monitoring for operationalization.
Okay.
Another word is dispatchability, right? So there's communication control and dispatchability, right? There's a lot to interoperability there, right? And yeah, so I guess that's another good word. That's got kind of a positive sound to it as well, dispatchability.
Okay. Other thoughts? Let me go back to the slide that Arthur originally asked about as well, this on the 3 protocols. Anybody from El Paso Electric or PNM have any thoughts about the use of these, where there is current experience, what the preferences, any thoughts about these protocols from the other 2 utilities on the line?
This is Ryan Size Buchanan from PNM.
All right.
Hi, I do apologize. Our technical team wasn't able to make it today. So I have taken this information down, but I don't have anything to shed any light on this. But I do want to have the ability to speak with them about it and provide some information back.
That would be great. Ryan, can I follow up with you or the correct representative before our next meeting to get that input?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. I'll do that. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Roberto, do you have any thoughts on these protocols? Okay, nothing from Roberto at this point. All right. Other thoughts. I see we have at least one manufacturer on the line, Steve Werlinger, and I don't know if anybody else from the equipment side of the house, any thoughts that you have about these, and I see Shannon also as, any thoughts about these protocols from an equipment manufacturer perspective?
I'll say that it is a really good summary of the requirements. I think it comes down to the utility specifying, which one or what system architecture they're going to implement to communicate with a DER site. Are they like California's looking at using 23.5 as they describe in what they call the CSIP. I think it's a common specification for inverter profile or something like that, or protocols. And it kind of explains, so IEEE 23.5 was updated in 2018. And the updates were to add the DER functional requirements that you've summarized here in the interoperability section, right? So even though 23.5 had communications for all the other devices that were talked about, like thermostats and other smart devices, it needs specific information and specifications for the technology. And so it was updated to include in 2018 to include the ability to handle these interoperability requirements for DER systems. Okay, so California is looking at adopting this and using it for communicating with sites. As Brian said, there's not a lot of that implemented yet. So it would be interesting to see, if other states, utilities, which one they think they're going to kind of start implementing, or if even they're going to worry about communications to the site. And maybe I think you had some questions about the size of the site. Maybe some, larger capacity sites may have more of an interest to getting this two-way information. And there is, in this interoperability, there is a lot of control elements to this. So a lot of the functions are control functions, as well as monitoring information from the site. So it's kind of a two-way communication. So I think, as we come out as manufacturers, we're picking one of these. Like some inverters may have, most likely may have Modbus ports, and you can add other devices at the site. So if a site has 10 inverters, you probably as a utility don't want to talk to each individual inverter. You'll be talking to the site. So there'll be some type of interface device, and then there'll be communications with the inverters. So it's really about the utilities kind of just, identifying what their system's going to be up to a site. And then I think the market will start driving those interface devices and the communications with different inverters, regardless of what's built into the inverter. We might have an inverter with 2030.5 port, or you might have inverters with only SunSpec Modbus ports. And a power plant controller might have the 2030.5 port.
So Steve, so from that, I'm understanding that then an inverter manufacturer might pick one protocol to build into that inverter versus having them all enabled, have all three enabled, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, definitely. And especially larger sites, there would be no reason to have, 23.5, SunSpec Modbus and all these ports, because there's most likely going to be a plant level controller controlling all the inverters. So that plant level controller would then communicate locally. Most of them probably use Modbus right now. That's what we'll use is SunSpec Modbus. And then the plant controller, depending on what the utility defines as their communication system. And as Brian said, a lot of this isn't being used. It's just basic SCADA at this point. So this is all new. Utilities still have to incorporate these advanced DNP3, and even DNP3 exists now, but it's being updated to include the 1547 interoperability functions.
Okay.
If I could, this is Brian again, if I could piggyback on what Steve was mentioning there, it does, I think a lot of the conversation, it hasn't really been formalized, but I think a lot of the conversation is in 1547 development and elsewhere has coalesced around the idea that you might have an inverter speaking whatever language, and then there's some sort of translation device, and that could be done at a plant controller, or maybe it's just a specialized translation device, so that if the utility or other entity is speaking, one of these languages and the inverter is speaking something else like Sunspec 2030.5, then that conversion can be done by a somewhat standardized translation device. So it's not necessary for the DER itself to provide the exact protocol that might get used on the utility or other provider's system.
In that case, there is a translator that aggregates and communicates to the utility.
Right, and it could be just for a single inverter, or it could be for an entire plant, say.
Brian, is that translator a part of what 1547.10 is intended to cover? Is that what a gateway is?
I would imagine that translation concept would be covered by that, but I believe the gateway is more the I guess I'm not 100% sure, but I think the gateway is talking about the device that handles the local DER communications interface functions to the outside world. So I guess it seems
Brian,
reasonable.
we talked about this.
Mhm.
Yes.
Are you hearing Steve? I'm not.
Let's see. Let's Brian, go ahead.
No, it might have dropped. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Brian. Hear me? You can hear me now? Okay.
Yes, Steve. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my internet was acting up. I didn't want to interrupt you, Brian, but yeah, everything you said was good. I was going to say something, but you covered it.
So to Mike's question was if that 1547.10 standard that's in development, which I wasn't able to find any information yet on that, covered this translator, the communication device between either one or a group of DERs to the utility. And Brian, your sense is I missed that in the conversation back and forth. So say again, Brian, what you believe that is the case. Or what?
I don't think that standard will necessarily discuss that translation, but it could touch upon it. But I think the standard is much broader in terms of its application to the whole local DER interface, local DER communications interface, as I recall. I'd have to look at the PAR, but I don't think any development per se has actually started on that. I think the PAR has been accepted, and they still need to spin up the working group.
Okay. Really just getting organized.
Mhm.
Okay. And then Michael, I see your comment in the chat that as you understand it, the DNP3 is fairly common in SCADA systems, and the overwhelming majority of inverters speak Modbus. Is that
Right. Yep. And any of the utility folks on the call can check me on that SCADA comment. That's the way I understand it. Is that DNP3 finds a lot of application on the SCADA side. But yeah, Steve was mentioning this just a minute ago. Within the plants, at the inverter level, I think almost all the inverters out there today and their plant controllers all speak Modbus.
okay? And thanks to Brian, who also put some information on about the on the 2030 roadmap published by IEEE. So that's a resource that we'll have, and I'll load it on the OneDrive site. So thanks for that, Brian. Well, I know this has been a quick conversation, but I think it's good to start to get various thoughts from people about this. And I don't know if anybody is willing to serve as a subgroup, kind of take this, digest it, chew on it, come back to the group with some ideas, some recommendation, and it could be anything from follow the standard to put some specific recommendations for the state of New Mexico, whatever you think might be the best for moving forward. Is anybody interested in serving as on the subgroup to kind of develop this and bring it back to the group for a comment next week? It'd be proposals specifically around this interoperability, communications, and controls piece. Travis, I see your hand up. Does that mean you're willing, or do you have a question?
Yes, I would like to volunteer, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Anybody else?
Margie, this is Arthur. This one strikes me as we really need the utility participation on this, because these are decisions that the utilities are going to have to make. And so I guess my basic question is, aside from Excel, and Travis has been very helpful in all this, that PNM and El Paso, do you have resident experts? I mean, is there a big learning curve that your folks are going to have to traverse in order to be able to sufficiently address this stuff? Because that's a really important thing. I know that our commission does not have the native expertise, right? And so there's going to be several layers of translation necessary in order for the commission to feel comfortable about approving something. And it's certainly not going to be the kind of proceeding in which people file briefs and then it goes to a hearing examiner and a hearing examiner chooses among options. Is that we really want to reach a consensus on this kind of decision making, even if there's differences among the utilities. We recognize that there might be, as long as it all can work together, right? So that's really my big picture concern, is that I know that I have to learn a lot in order to even understand what you're talking about, let alone what the commissioners are going to have to learn in order to make a decision about it. So kind of like, can we start at the first step, which is, do the utilities have people on board who are capable of grappling with this right now? Or is that something that has to happen? Anyway.
This is Ryan from PNM again. So I can't speak to our entire company to see if there is somebody who is a resident expert. I will say that I personally will have to come up to speed on this. I do not have any experience with it. As I stated, I am taking this information back and we'll hopefully have those discussions, and we'll be able to provide some additional information if we have somebody that has experience with these protocols and communications.
Mostly because, while we have the outside expertise of Cindy and Michael and the IREC folks who've been working in other jurisdictions, it might be incumbent upon us to kind of try and find another level of expertise to help with this. And I suppose that the July 14th session, which is a communication protocols expert presentation, is probably the place to start on that. So if we can't form a subgroup today, we maybe kind of like put our efforts into making sure that everybody understands where we're going, and then somebody Michael knows enough to be dangerous. Yeah, well, that's all of us here. So I want to make sure that we're not running before we walk. basically.
This is Brian. I think trying to understand what the goal, what the outcome of the task group might be a good overall discussion to have, because if we say, like come up with a plan to interconnect DER to the communication systems of all utilities, that's a pretty big thing to bite off and do, especially without a lot of outside input. So I would say, from my perspective, one of the first things that would be kind of I don't know about necessary, but at least helpful to move in the direction of implementing communications would be to have some sort of roadmap. And so maybe the outcome of the task group is not, all the nuts and bolts of how to communicate with DER, but just a roadmap of how the New Mexico utilities would intend to move in that direction.
So yeah, Brian, I'm looking at your and MidHot's decision matrix around this topic, and I noticed the two options in the previous version were either specify the protocols and ports to be used or stay silent on that, do not specify those. And we could start at the very basic level of having that conversation on the subgroup as, is it important to specify those, or do we leave them unspecified? And there's probably advantages and disadvantages of each. And I think that Arthur's counsel is wise, is that we gain the input and expertise and perspectives of the 3 IOUs in particular, because they will have a lot at stake in this integration. So I think we're really very much starting out from the perspective of what makes sense for New Mexico, what's going to achieve the goals of interoperability, allow these resources to also support voltage and frequency when as needed on the grid, play the full role of support for distributed energy resources. To do that, you really do have to have some specific communication protocol. So I think our objective is fairly clear, but what goes in this proposal to the commission on this topic is still open. I see that Curtis Hutchinson is on the line also from El Paso Electric. Curtis, do you have some thoughts about going forward on this? I have been unable to maybe hear from El Paso Electric.
Well, I'm not the technical side of it. That's the Roberto and Ty. I'm just sitting here to follow the case of the rulemaking side. So
okay,
we're kind of monitoring for that piece of it.
Perfect. Okay, good. Thanks for being here. Okay, and I do see that Ty is on as well. Ty, what is you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I don't believe we have the right resources participating in the communication portion of this. We're more the protection settings and control piece and reliability and safety aspect of this. So yeah, we need to take it back to our communications group and really get them involved and get more information from them as to what direction we're taking.
Okay. So sounds like I have an action to follow up with El Paso Electric, probably through Ty, through you or Roberto, and follow up with Ryan at PNM and have a conversation about getting the right perspective and input into this from those two companies. So Travis, we will count on you again to be our fearless leader of this subgroup, and I will commit to getting you some help. And I'll also volunteer Michael Ropp, who's part of he's my phone a friend on this topic and has been made available through the support of Sandia National Labs for a few hours each month. So Michael can also help us translate and reach out and integrate information. So I think between you and Michael and I will get some additional help, and certainly anybody else is welcome to participate on this subgroup.
It would be really helpful if everybody who's on the call today think very clearly about what you need to know, right? I don't even know what I need to know yet before we can move forward. And so, you know, I'm going to be listening to this and asking, you know, really fundamental questions about stuff. But, you know, it'd be really helpful if we got a sense of where your information gaps are in terms of understanding this before we move down a path that kind of like leaves anybody behind. That's what I want to avoid. I really want us to move forward as a group so that we can make consensus decisions if possible to bring to the commission in the long run, right? As I said, this is not going to happen overnight. It's probably not even going to happen in the next 6 months because these things take time. But I want to make sure that we're all moving down the path together.
Good. So in that vein, if you have questions that have surfaced in this conversation this hour or other ones come to you, let me know what those are and we'll start collecting those questions and try to find answers from various resources around the country that can answer those questions. So no question is too simple or too complex. We'll at least give it an attempt to answer. So if you'd send those questions to me, I'll aggregate them and we'll go after trying to get answers. Great. So I know this has been a short conversation, but we wanted to get it started. We wanted to move this topic along. The actions out of today, I'll just summarize here before we wrap up. We'll continue to press ahead with the subgroup. I'll work with Travis and Michael and Ryan and Ty Roberto to find the right composition of that subgroup. And please send to me any questions you have on this topic, and I will be I'll collect those and send them to the subgroup, and together we'll try to get answers. We'll have another conversation on the 14th, which is in 2 weeks. I have not been able to find the best person to give us pros and cons of the various protocols, but that may not be what we want. We may need other questions answered. So if you all can send me your questions, preferably early next week after you've enjoyed a nice 4th of July holiday, and I will work to try to find someone who can tackle those questions and make a presentation to us in 2 weeks. Please also have a look at the subgroups proposal that now includes some language on the reference point of applicability. And we will plan to meet again in 2 weeks. Of course, some of this work is being done offline and be presented back to the group for conversation. I know it's a fast schedule, but we really want to work to get our report together before the early part of September so we can present it to the PRC on the 16th. With that, let me ask if there are any questions or closing questions by the group, and then any closing comments by Arthur. So questions to begin with. All right, Arthur, any final comments?
No, not for today. Thank you very much. We appreciate your participation. As I said, well, you know, it's a little fuzzy beginning here, but it's really important, and it's important to get it right, because we certainly don't want people investing money in things that aren't going to work. Right? That's really kind of top of my mind today. So thank you all very much, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds great. And you'll see a meeting summary coming from Deb Shields, along with a meeting announcement for the 14th as we get closer to that. So my great thanks to Deborah Shields for handling the keeping people in touch with our activities, and to Miguel also at the PRC for being our technical support. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margie.